Hello. I am, well, as you're watching this, I am in Washington, D.C. with students from the Political Affairs Club and the International Relations Club. And if you are watching this on Friday, September 26th, if you're watching this at class time, 9:30, which I'm not sure is the case, I'm actually at the State Department with students visiting an alum who works at the State Department. This is actually my maiden voyage with this particular type of technology to record a lecture. It's called Camtasia. I'm hoping that what's going to happen after I'm done is that this is going to be available on the web, and thus you can probably watch it whenever you want to watch it. I'm here in what's called the Digital Media Library Resource Room over in Milne Library, and I'm basically looking at a computer screen that has a camera on top of it to record what I have to say. And so it's a really different experience when you're talking to what really is kind of a screen there with a pretty scene of a mountain lake rather than a room full of students. And I'll tell you, I very much prefer to talk to the students, have the live presentation rather than doing what I am currently doing. But it is what it is. I appreciate you tolerating my absence, and I certainly do miss being there with you, even though I actually probably am enjoying myself in Washington, D.C. With other political science and international relations majors. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, really things that I would do if I were there. There really probably could have been some other stuff that could have been done, I think, to make use of the technology. And maybe if I have time, I'll kind of add some other things to it. One of the things that's kind of easier with this thing called Camtasia is actually to insert things, to insert videos or graphs, or actually even kind of delete things and then redo it. But I'm probably going to keep this very simple and very straightforward. I don't have quite the advantage of a blackboard back here or a whiteboard back here to write things down. So I'll try to go slow, and I'll try to I have paper that I can write on sometimes to convey my thoughts to you. Let's see how that kind of works. Okay. Sorry. So what I'm going to do today is this is really going to be one of the only times we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what we call unconventional forms of political participation. Now, throughout this course, we spend a lot of time talking about political participation. There's lots of different ways that citizens can participate in politics. Certainly in a democracy, they can vote, and that's kind of the thing that occupies a lot of our time. There's a lot of other things that they could do. They could wear a button, they could wear a t-shirt, they could put a bumper sticker on their car, they could write a letter, they could send an email, they could speak at a rally, they could tweet something, they could post something on Facebook or what have you. They can give money. They can go to a town council meeting. There's just tons and tons and tons of things that citizens can do to participate in American politics and a democracy. Okay. What's different about what we're going to talk about today, what I'm going to talk about today, is what we call unconventional forms of political participation. Everything that I have mentioned thus far is what we call conventional forms of political participation. And so and by conventional, we basically just simply mean that they fit with societal norms. And so people find them acceptable things to do. Now, maybe sometimes some people, raise their eyes at people wearing political T-shirts, and probably some things that people put on political T-shirts may even generate more than a raising of the eyebrows there. And some people have signs. Some signs are obscene. And that's maybe, that can be stuff that's unconventional, but some of the stuff like buttons is fairly conventional. So we're kind of talking about stuff, when we say unconventional, that's kind of outside of the acceptable norms of society. Okay, and of course, what is acceptable norms of society can change over time and vary. So I'm gonna talk about that, and so it's kind of stuff that can be edgy. It can be illegal. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today are forms of political participation that are actually illegal. So anything that's illegal is unconventional, but some stuff that is unconventional, is certainly not illegal. But I guess in my mind is unconventional and would probably raise some eyebrows with it. So some of the things that we're going to be interested in with regard to unconventional forms of political participation are things like the following. Who does it? Who doesn't do it? Why do some people do it, and why do some people not do it? Is it effective? Is unconventional forms of political participation an effective means of political participation, or is it not really an effective means for getting what one wants in society? What are the goals of unconventional forms of political participation? I suppose some parts of it, like having a bumper sticker or a T-shirt or a button, may just be about expressiveness, and people just do it in order to express what they think and how they feel, and maybe just because that makes them feel good, rather than a reason that some people might engage in unconventional forms of political participation, excuse me, is because they want to bring about some type of change. And so the question is, are they effective means for bringing about change? Okay, and are all unconventional forms of political participation equal in terms of being a means for bringing about change? Okay, so there's kind of one way we can categorize political participation is we can talk about it as being conventional, unconventional. Another way we can talk about it is being legal or illegal. So some types of unconventional political participation is legal. For example, I would call a protest, march, or demonstration a type of unconventional political participation. It's legal. Nothing's wrong with it. It's kind of a little bit out there. So an example could be, a march on D.C. and demonstrations that occurred at the party's conventions when they have held them. Some kind of could be illegal, though. So, for example, the Occupy Wall Street movement. Some of that occupied public park place, and eventually they were removed. Some type of protest demonstrations have been illegal. Some sit-ins are illegal. Some sit-ins are legal. So sometimes people have sat places in order to prevent other people from entering a building. So, for example, at abortion clinics in the United States, there's cases where anti-abortion protesters have sat outside those clinics in an attempt to either block access to people who work there or for women who are going in to attain abortions or to make a visit at those clinics, or just to kind of make the point. The Supreme Courts have actually ruled that some of that stuff, violates rights by denying access to such buildings. And so in some cases, sit-ins are illegal. A kind of famous set of sit-ins that were also illegal were lunch counter sit-ins in the South when a number of African Americans went to lunch counters, I believe in North Carolina, to protest segregation. And so they were actually breaking the law in those cases by sitting in areas of it was at, I think, like a Woolworths. So it was actually in a department store where it had to set a counter there to serve lunch or probably dinner as well. And they were sitting in the area that was segregated for whites. Okay, that was illegal. What they did. Okay, other types of illegal, unconventional forms of participation. Or let me see. That's illegal. So protest activities, maybe even wearing a T-shirt, excuse me, could be considered unconventional. There's also unconventional forms of political participation that are illegal. Again, I mentioned lunch counter sit-ins and citizen sit-ins at abortion clinics. There could be occupation of buildings, or again the occupation of some parks by Occupy Wall Street. During the 1960s and 1970s, most of it really occurred in the 1970s on college campuses when the anti-Vietnam War movement was most robust and really powerful. What you had occur were a lot of sit-in demonstrations at college campuses, and in a number of cases, students took over administration buildings in protest of the Vietnam War and in protest of the colleges are typically mostly the government's policies on the war. So certainly illegal to occupy a building. Some sit-ins can be another type of unconventional participation. Could be a boycott. Could boycott candidates, could boycott commercials, could boycott products. So that's some examples of unconventional, and some of which is illegal. There is also unconventional political participation that is violent, and so illegal and violent. And examples of that are the following. Riots in the United States, as I assume most of you know, in the United States in the 1960s and also happened in 1992 in Los Angeles surrounding Rodney King. There were race riots. Actually, it was commemorated recently in Rochester, New York. Rochester, New York had riots in 1964. There were some cities that had pretty significant riots. I mean, lots of property destruction. Famous ones were Watts in Los Angeles area, the Detroit riots, riots in Atlanta. There was millions, maybe billions of dollars of property that were destroyed. In those riots, there were many people who were killed in those riots. Some of them were police officers and firemen that were killed by snipers. And, of course, even some of the local population was actually killed during the course of the riots. So those are probably the most extreme type of violent political activity that we have in the United States. Another example, actually, of unconventional violent political activity would be the Oklahoma City bombing in I believe it was 1994. Timothy McVeigh and another guy pulled up a truck outside of a government building in Oklahoma City, and they had made a bomb out of fertilizer, blew up, killed something like 170 people there. Politically motivated. They were members of Michigan militia there, and were very, 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 very strong anti-government views. You could call the September 11th bombings a type of probably not maybe a political activity, given it was basically attack, I guess. Certainly politically motivated, maybe a little bit different than the Oklahoma City bombings because, I mean, that's almost by definition kind of war activities are politically motivated. But so the Oklahoma City bombings and the riots in the 1960s are maybe the most extreme forms of unconventional, illegal, violent types of political activity. So some participation can be unconventional but legal, can be unconventional and illegal, but not violent. Or it could be unconventional, illegal and violent and destructive. In some cases, destructive of property, in some cases, destructive of human beings. Examples of ones that are destructive of property but not destructive of people would be the following. There's a group called Earth First, which is a pro-environmental group, and they've been very active in the Pacific Northwest, and they're very much opposed to logging. And so one thing that they have done is they have gone into those areas where logging is occurring, and they sometimes will pour salt or other chemicals in the gas containers for the machinery that's used by the logging industry. So they don't actually kill people. What they're doing is the destruction of property that is there to try to disrupt the logging activities. Okay, so we got this kind of range too of political activities. On the one hand, there's stuff like wearing the T-shirt and the bumper sticker, and on the other hand, there's actually killing people. All of it trying to perhaps achieve some type of political purpose. And so I want to talk about cases where that type of where some types of unconventional political activity is successful, and other cases where it is not successful. Other examples, I guess, of violence, could be also the assassinations. So, assassination of Martin Luther King, assassination of John Kennedy, assassination of Robert Kennedy, attempted assassinations on political leaders like George Wallace, and so we've had that in the United States as well. And I think to some extent, when you have violent protest that is destructive, and sometimes even nonviolent protest that I'll talk about can also institute some destructiveness, even though the violence is not initiated by those doing the protesting. A lot of times, you might say it kind of indicates some type of dysfunctionality with the political system. And so, generally, we're going to look at people's expression of discontent as turning in these unconventional modes. And probably, for the most part, we kind of see that the conventional means are not really working, that these people feel that they are shut off from the conventional means of political participation. Now, you don't want to push the argument too far with that, because there are people maybe, again, that are just kind of crazy and kind of loony, and the actions of one person maybe doesn't say something for the society as a whole. So, one person can engage in some type of violent political activity and wouldn't necessarily say to me that the political system as a whole has some element of dysfunctionality to it. However, to the extent you have lots of people engaging in some type of unconventional and perhaps even illegal political activity, for sure, and particularly if it's over a sustained period of time, it probably indicates some serious type of problem occurring in that society. It's not able to channel people's grievances through the more conventional, that is, less destructive means. And so in some cases, sometimes the way societies kind of deal with that problem is to try to, again, channel that into a more conventional type of means. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean people are going to succeed, when they channel it into conventional means. Maybe they have a better chance of succeeding. Maybe they don't have a better chance of succeeding. But it's less disruptive. And, violence certainly is disruptive. Okay. Now, what are the characteristics of people who participate in unconventional means of political participation? So, put that out there as a question. You could think about it. I could go get a drink of water, come back, go around the library, see what's going on there, get myself a cup of coffee. But I'll just kind of talk and let you think about it. And okay, well, here's what we think about those people who have engaged in unconventional means of political participation, even those that are illegal. And they generally have two particular characteristics about them that are striking. One is they themselves as individuals actually tend to have a high sense of what we call political efficacy. And what I mean by that is they are interested in politics. So these are people who actually have a high level of interest in politics. They also feel themselves to be very politically effective. And by that I mean they believe they really understand politics. They understand what's going on in the country. They have explanations for why things are going the way that they are. And so their own sense of competence with respect to politics is actually quite high. Their own sense of interest is actually quite high. Part of what they see, though, is that the political system is not responsive to them. So generally what they believe is that the conventional means of political participation are actually not open to them. They tend to be in many cases people who have a high level of frustration, and so they tend to be pretty annoyed, pretty upset. They feel themselves competent and capable, but they're not getting the type of results that they would like. So they turn to these unconventional means of political participation in order to try to attain the outcomes that they would like to see brought about. Okay, they tend to also, in many cases, have a sense of kind of moral superiority, a belief in their own righteousness. Now, I do think, if you listen to politicians on both sides these days in the country, and certainly a lot of commentators, they talk about their preferences being absolutely right, being absolutely morally right. Okay, not only maybe they believe that the tax system ought to be changed, or the tax system should not be changed, or that we should adjust the Common Core, or we should change the laws in gay marriage, but they often, can make it in moral issues. However, there's also a lot of issues, and a lot of people, I think, really deep down, also recognize, particularly actually politicians, I think, really recognize that even though it's not the language that they typically use, that really we're just talking about different interests, and that there is no moral right. At least in many cases there. And so people have different interests. They have different things that they value, different things that they prefer. And that's really the bottom line for why they would like to have one thing done versus something else done there. But I think with respect to violent types of political participation, particularly illegal, people have to have a really, really strong sense of kind of a moral superiority to do some things that are actually going to be destructive for others. So, take kind of extreme examples. You can look at the Oklahoma City bombers, Timothy McVeigh and somebody Nichols, I forget his first name, who was there. And I mean, they really believed in the moralness of what they were doing. I mean, in a moralness, correctness for something that ended up killing, 170 people, some of whom were children. They were children in a daycare center there. And certainly, again, I'm sure you're all familiar with the September 11th bombers. And they had a sense that, they were doing the morally righteous thing. There was never apparently any doubt in their minds about they were doing. So another thing that you see is actually people who have a high sense of efficacy, of interest, frustration with their lives and how things are going for their lives, and a really, really, really high belief in their own moral superiority that really allows them to diminish others, those who they are attacking. And so they're able to use that to kind of justify or rationalize in their own minds the correctness of what they're doing, even though the correctness of what they're doing actually leads to the death of some people, or in some cases, the destruction of property. Okay. So that's what we generally know about the motivations for individuals that engage in unconventional forms of political participation. Now, I want to say some things about when unconventional political participation is successful and when unconventional political participation is not successful. Okay, one example of unconventional and sometimes actually illegal, but nonviolent political participation being successful would be, in my mind, the civil rights movement, particularly in the 1950s. And there's actually a nice kind of contrast with it with the 1960s, because I think what happened in the United States in the 1950s for the civil rights movement was successful. And it also highlights the goal of really lots of these types of unconventional means of political participation. Okay, the unconventional political participation in the civil rights movement in the 1950s generally involved protest activity, involved marches, in some cases involved some individual acts that got a lot of attention. Rosa Parks sitting in the front of the bus, on a segregated bus in the South, and thereby breaking the law. That was as an individual. But let me talk about kind of the civil rights marches as organized and led by Martin Luther King in the 1950s. Okay, so this was the strategy of Martin Luther King. They were going to protest and they were going to demonstrate. And they were protesting segregation, and they were protesting that the quality of life for African Americans in the South particularly, but you could argue throughout the country, was of lower quality than what it was for Caucasian Americans. Okay, so they would protest, they would demonstrate. Now, one thing that Martin Luther King actually expected to have happen in these demonstrations was that there would be violence. But the violence that was expected was to be initiated by the generally police in the area, or not entirely, the white police in the area. And so Martin Luther King not only made clear in his writings at the time and talk at the time that he expected violence, he actually wanted violence to occur. But he did not want the people who were protesting to be the initiators of the violence. They were to be peaceful. And in fact, if they were to be hit, have dogs sicked upon them, if they were to be harmed in any way by people attacking them violently, their response was to be passive. And they were just to take it. And the violence then was initiated by the white authorities in the South. Now, the effect of that was to did a number of things. It gave them the moral high ground because they were not the initiators of the violence. They were the recipients of the violence. They, in some cases, were breaking laws, but the laws were that they couldn't protest, or they didn't have a permit in order to protest. They weren't destroying any property. They really were not disrupting any activities. They were just going in a march through a city or on a street. So that's what they were doing. And so their actions, even though technically they could be seen as illegal, they actually were not violent, and they were not destructive, and they were not disruptive of any type of activities. So it gave them the moral high ground when the violence was visited upon them. Okay. The other thing that occurred is then what it did is it gave those issues a lot of attention, because one thing we know about the media and one thing we know about the public is there's a lot of focus on violence. So when violence occurs, it gets attention. It gets attention all the time. It could be the violence from a storm, from a flood, from an earthquake, from a fire, or from people killing other people, or from war. So it really focused on the issues in the South and really started to get people outside of the South really interested in issues of segregation and integration in the South, and it got that issue on the agenda. So one way that protest activities or unconventional forms of activity can sometimes be very successful is getting attention on a particular issue out there. And so in that case, it succeeded. If it is the case excuse me, that the violence is initiated by the protesters, then I think they typically lose the moral high ground, and then people get upset with them and the rest of the public views them as a problem and becomes less sympathetic and less concerned with them. Another kind of example of sort of the civil rights movement succeeding in a way that demonstrates when unconventional forms of political participation can be successful is the lunch counter demonstrations that I mentioned. And if you saw the movie, I think it was called The Butler, there of a couple, I don't know, maybe it's a year or two or three ago, and there's a part in there that actually is a replay of those demonstrations. But the African-American students come in, sit down on a lunch counter in an area that's whites only, and the white students, dump ketchup on them, dump sugar on them, scream at them, yell at them, and the African-American students just take it there. And really then, there was pictures of that were replayed. I don't know how much there was video of that was replayed. But people outside of the South would look at that and say, well, God, all they're doing is sitting at the lunch counter, and it really made the whites who were there, the white young people generally who were there, look very, very abusive, and they were kind of initiating the harm in other people for some who were demonstrating passively and were not doing anything that was really disruptive. And so it got a lot of attention, and some people then became really concerned about it. Okay. You can also though look at what happened, and again, Martin Luther King told people when he recruited them to be in these marches that we're actually expecting violence. In some ways, we're actually hoping for violence, and when that violence occurs, you should actually accept it. And if that's not you, if you can't do that, we don't want you. We don't want you to be part of it. And so that was part of the coaching that they did. Now, kind of an interesting sort of then contrast was that is the types of political activity that I already talked about that involved race, and that was the race riots in American cities, mostly in the 1960s. They occurred in, 1964, 1965, 1967, 1968. There were a number that occurred after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And there were cases where cities were, whole sections of them were lit up through arson, and there were some African Americans who were snipers, so they set things on fire. When policemen and firemen came, they tried to pick them off. There was billions and billions of dollars that were destroyed. But in this case, these were protest activities. These were violent protest activities. And in this case, the violent protest activities were initiated by African Americans. And so one effect of it was the kind of then turn whites against the civil rights movement, seeing that these people were actually initiating violence, and that made them a bit scary. Parenthetically, what also, of course, was happening at the time is there were a number of other African American leaders of this, civil rights or cause. I'm not sure if that's the right term that I would use to describe some of them. But leaders like H. Rep. Brown and Eldridge Cleaver, and probably the most famous is Malcolm X. And there's another group you might have heard of, the Black Panthers. And these were groups that expressed much more, not only more antagonistic views towards Caucasians, but also views towards Caucasians that in some cases were advocating violence. And so that started to turn a lot of other, Caucasians outside of the South, very much against the civil rights movement, and kind of helped, kind of ended there. What also kind of happened, just parenthetically, is the issues became much more complicated in the sense that it was one thing to say that we're going to end segregation and integration. Okay, that's a change in law, and people could accept that. And then issues became kind of more complicated in the sense that people start talking about busing, or talking about redistribution of economic resources, or some things to deal with the imbalance of economic equality or opportunity that exists for African Americans and Caucasians. And then it kind of seemed much more like a zero-sum game there, that if you were going to give some things to African Americans, well, that meant that whites were not going to have those things or have less access to those schools, or their children were going to be bused. And so the other part was that the issues just got much more complicated in a way, and seemed to involve more winners and losers, and really political issues, if you will. And so that also contributed to the end of the civil rights movement for that particular point in time. Okay. The another thing, I guess I kind of want to highlight too, in the civil rights movement, as well as a number of other movements, would actually be good examples of this. But a point I want to make is that oftentimes protest activity has as its goal pointing attention to an issue. And so if you look at, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the goal there was to point attention to income inequality in the United States. And so they demonstrated, in the beginning in a park in New York City near Wall Street. Got a lot of attention. They're not just kind of there marching or demonstrating, they're camping there. They're going to live there. They're setting up these little communities there. So, you can see too that, one part sometimes of unconventional political activity is drawing attention to a particular cause or a particular type of issue there. So it's trying to get something on the agenda there. And then I would say in my own mind that, the Occupy movement actually had a certain amount of success, at least in drawing attention to that issue. I think it was pretty problematic for the Republicans in 2012 in the election. I don't think it was only the Occupy movement, but I think it did get a lot of people's attention. I mean, probably everybody had to know at least that it was going on, and thus get some attention on the level of income inequality in the United States. Kind of a side point there is also the fact that Mitt Romney, I think, turned out to be kind of a poor candidate for the Republicans Party, given the fact that he was worth $250 million and had been a venture capitalist. And so he kind of became sort of a poster boy for economic inequality. I think Mitt Romney is a nice guy, a great guy. I think he's, broke no laws. I think he's actually a very good human being there. He's very wealthy, has been very successful. He did it legally, but he then became, to some people, emblematic of that level of economic inequality. And that was a bad thing for the Republicans. I guess what I also want to talk about is some cases where the political power was changed, or some groups were able to attain the franchise through protest activity, and also some cases then where it was successful. So as we talked about, or you all know, the United States, when it started off, we have the right to the franchise granted only to white males who own property, and eventually it is granted to property owners who are white males for the most part in the United States, and it's granted to them, and it's granted to them really because the political parties are trying to get more votes. But then eventually it's granted to more extensively to African Americans, eventually to women, and eventually to those 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And in those three cases, for African Americans, for women, and for young people, in every case it resulted from, part of it was unconventional forms of political participation. Of course, by definition, if you're a group that's excluded, from the process, voting is not open to you. So the conventional means of political participation are legally not open to you. And so for women to gain the right to vote, they had to engage in unconventional forms of political participation. And basically then after a while what happened is it was granted, the right to vote was granted to them, and so then the protest activity stops. There's really very little incidents of violence in that case. With respect to civil rights and African Americans and young people, there's both unconventional forms of political participation that were illegal, and some that were illegal, and some that were violent. And so it is the case that by granting those groups the franchise and allowing them to vote, it means that their discontent and dissatisfaction and their preferences can now be channeled through the electoral process or through the more conventional means of political participation. They can vote, they can write letters, they can make phone calls, they can do those things, and those activities are less disruptive than are the protest activities. So that's kind of a benefit in where all of that has gone. Okay, and now I'm looking over my notes, and that's kind of about it. So my key points on this are that the activity can be successful. Okay, it can get attention to a cause or to an issue, but the key things is whether or not those protesting initiate the violence. And if they initiate the violence, it's not a good outcome for them. Usually then they lose the moral high ground. They may not always win anyway. Excuse me, with it. But if they do become violent, they lose. If the other side becomes violent, like it did in the civil rights movement, they have a much better chance of succeeding. So a lot of the activities with protest groups these days are probably a little more coordinated than they had been at some particular points in time. Okay. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk just a little bit in kind of see, I'm making this for Friday. I don't know quite how far I'm going to get on Wednesday, which is tomorrow, as I record this. Okay, but let me say some things kind of about the social capital. And social capital is the thing that I hope I talked about Wednesday. And social capital, high levels of social capital, I would also say, are likely to be associated with low levels of unconventional political participation, and particularly low levels of unconventional, violent, illegal political participation. So unconventional political participation, in some ways, is almost partly kind of a counter or the opposite of having high social capital, because high social capital, as I talked about on Wednesday, means that individuals know each other and work with each other and trust each other. So usually high levels of social capital are sort of an ingredient produces a well-functioning society. So according to Robert Putnam, who's kind of the at least most well-known proponent of social capital, it is the case that social capital means that a society is working very well, and the unconventional, violent type of political activity means that a society is kind of, falling apart. And so, to me, it's also kind of an interesting contrast. In our society, social capital has, at least according to Putnam, and probably a lot of other people, has diminished. There's some little debate about whether or not it's kind of, just kind of changed into be part of some other types of activities. I actually think Putnam has a lot right about it there, that social capital has diminished. However, one thing that's kind of interesting with respect to it is the following, that what he sees as the heyday of high levels of social capital in the United States, the 1940s and 1950s, where social capital was really quite high, and we had a lot of people involved in society, involved in a lot of associations, a lot of clubs, and a lot of organizations, is also a time where actually race relations were not really particularly good. And so even though our level of social capital today is lower maybe than what it was 40, 50 years ago, I would argue, and I think most people would, that our race relations are much better than they were there. I mean, maybe a prime example being the election of an African American as president. But I also think that there's lots of examples of increased racial tolerance in American society today compared to what there was 40, 50 years ago. Also, if you look at Americans' views towards homosexuals, is you all know there's been really dramatic change in the United States in pretty much the past 20 years in Americans' attitudes towards gays Americans. And so you might kind of think of that too as kind of a way in which our society functions better by having higher rates of tolerance there compared to what we used to have. So in that sense, it's kind of a better functioning society. So, it's kind of a very complicated picture there with respect to the extent that we have this sort of respect and tolerance of each other and acceptance. In some ways, American society is much better than it previously had been, even though there's some other ways in which perhaps it does not function quite as well as it had previously. Okay. So I think what I'm going to do is end there. Again, this is my maiden voyage with this particular form of technology, and so I don't think I pushed it as far as it could be pushed there, or utilized it as much as it could be utilized. I hope this worked for you. I'll have to think about whether it worked for me doing it, and I look forward to seeing you on Monday after I have returned from Washington, D.C. Thank you.